Today we're talking about Entity Framework, which is an object relational mapping framework. And what this framework allows us to do is to interact with the database through code rather than having to write scripts or store procedures on the database and then interact with those. It's supposed to make things easier and faster. Entity Framework can be confusing and a scary concept, but I'm hoping this quick demo will show you that it's not so bad and will motivate you to learn more. To speed things up, we're not even going to use a database. We're going to use an in-memory database, which is actually a pretty good trick. If you have to prototype and you just want to prove that your code can do something without actually going through the extra work of creating, building, setting up a database, this is a good option. So in order to do that, we need two packages from NuGet. So let's get those. The two packages we need have to do with Entity Framework. So if I type Entity Framework Core in here, the first one with 1.5 billion downloads is certainly the most important because this has all the logic and functionality to make Entity Framework possible. The next one is our in-memory package. And like I mentioned, we're not going to use a database. We're going to simulate it all in memory. So we'll need this package too. Let's ensure that they're there. Yep, they're both there. Okay, we can move on to the next step. The next step is create the entity which represents the data in the database. It's not really the table in the database, it's actually a record in that table. I'll show you what I mean. Let's create a new folder and we'll call it models because the classes in this folder are going to model what's in the database. And we'll make a new class called pet, as if we have a pets table with thousands of records of different pets. So we add a class and we'll call it pet, because even though I mentioned that this is a table full of thousands of pets, this entity is one record in that table. It's a pet. And so the first thing that Microsoft Visual Studio recommends is the ID field, which is a great idea because by convention in Entity Framework, if you have a field called ID, that is automatically your primary key. So great. What else? We could have a string, some name, and now it's suggesting string description, but let's change that to breed like we have dogs or something. Or we'll make these nullable, and if you don't know why we're making these nullable, check out my other video. I think this is good. Here's an entity that represents a record in the pets table. There's three columns, an ID, the primary key, and a name and a breed. So now that we have the entity, let's set up the whole framework part of this entity framework. Okay, this next part gets a little spicy. Let's add a new folder, and we'll call it data. And this folder is going to be the connection that's going to hold the logic that allows our objects in our code to talk to this database. So within our data folder, we'll add a class, and we'll call this class app DB context, application database context. In other words, the context, the whole environment that this is running in, the context of the connection between the code and the database. Heady stuff. What makes this work is that our class appDBContext inherits from DBContext, something that comes from Entity Framework. So you won't see Entity Framework up here, but when I add DBContext, if I spell it right, you'll see that it just got added. Now that we are inheriting from DB context, we can set up our class to use the in-memory database. So let's make our constructor, the code that creates this class. It's called app dbContext. And the parameter that we're passing in, and this is where it gets a little tricky, but we'll get through it, is a db context options. Because the option we're giving it is use in-memory database. So you can see that this is starting to fill things out for us automatically. It's giving us the type app dbContext. So much like if you have a list and you say list string means that your list is going to handle strings, this dbContext option is set up for the app dbContext class. And then it gives it the name options, and then it uses the base constructor for this, because we have to pass that option that we're using in memory database up to the parent class. That's a lot, I understand. And they put it all in one line. It's when they abstract the complexity for us to try to make it easier, sometimes it gets trickier, right? Because it's harder to understand what's going on. Also, I've used inheritance and abstraction. So those are two of the 4 core principles of object-oriented programming. You should know the other 2 in case you have an interview coming up soon. What are the 4 pillars of object-oriented programming? So now that we've set up the constructor to use the options to tell it to use in-memory database, we need to tell it about the entity that we set up. So let's set that up. It's a db set, and the entity is pet, and we will call it pets. All right, very good. This helps us with the connection to the database. This helps us define what's in the database. I know it's a lot. So we have another tricky part coming up, setting up this whole options thing. So let's go do that. With great courage, we push forward. We have to do one more tricky thing, and then we can have fun with this. And that one last tricky thing is to set up that options, which is going to tell the context to use in in-memory database. It's not really that hard, but it's not the easiest either. So let's just do it. We have a variable called options, and this options, we say new db context options builder. So you see that it threw the entity framework in there for us. So this new db context options builder is going to create a db context option. It's going to build it for us. And where did we see db context option before? We saw that here. So that's where that comes from. So let's build it. We have to say app db context. And when we do that, you can see that it puts our data namespace here, because that's where the app db context lives. And now that we have that, we can finally say use in memory database, and then just for laughs we'll say database name is, I don't know, inmemdb. Okay. So what do we do with this options object that we just built? We know that it's a db context option. We know that's the parameter that gets passed into our app db context. So when we say using var context equals, and this is where we instantiate the app db context, new app db context, and what are we passing in? That's correct, the options. Well, that was a struggle, but you know what's cool? Now we can actually do what we set off to do. Interact with this in-memory database just using code. Let's create a few new records in our database just with code. We say context, because context, remember, is this environment that's connecting our code and this database together. So the context, pets, because that's part of our context, right? The pets table, dot add. And now we're going to add a new pet object. So we could do that, or we could just say using, let's do that. Then we don't have to have all this extra code. New pet. So actually it's suggesting we specify ID1. We don't have to do that. It's going to do that automatically for us, but we do have to say name. Oh, I forgot the semicolon. That blew everything up right there. Okay. Name is Barky the dog, and the breed is, I don't know, a husky. Let's create another one. Context dot pets dot add a new pet with the name Rex, and the breed is mutt. And then we say context dot save changes. And what this actually does when this code runs, it's going to set up this context so we can interact with this database. Then it's going to say, hey, there's a table called pets. Let's add these records to it. And then it's going to save that, and we will prove that those records have been saved, because what we're going to do next is we're going to query the database. We're going to say var our pets equals the context, the table, pets, to a list. And because we have a list, we can say for each var pets and our pets, console write line, the pet's name is pet.name, and it is a pet.breed. All right. That was a lot. I hope it works. Let's find out. And when we run this, we would expect that 2 records are added to our database, to the table in our database, and that it prints out the name and the breed that we listed. So here we go. And it worked. Cool. Now that we know that we can add and look up records, let's try updating records. The last thing we'll do in this demo is update a record. Now that we have the context, it's pretty straightforward. First, we have to find a record to use. So I know that Barky is ID1 and Rex is ID2 because they're the only records we have. So let's say var my pet equals context dot pets dot single or default p such that p dot id equals 1. Oops, is not equals 1 but is 1. That retrieves Barky, and then we can say my pet dot name equals Dino, context dot save changes. So it's telling us that pet could be null here, and if you try to do this with a null object, it'll blow up. But so there should be try catches to make sure it doesn't blow up. I'm gonna live life on the edge and just go this way. I'm gonna take our code that prints and put it down here so that we can see that now instead of saying Barky and Rex, it's gonna say Dino and Rex. Let's see if that's true. There you go. We updated it. So what did we do? We created, we read, we updated. You know where this is going. What's the last letter in this acronym? It would be D, delete. We'll leave that deleting for a exercise for the viewer. Okay, that was actually a lot longer than I thought it was going to be. But I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something, and I hope you are interested to learn more about Entity Framework. I'll see you in the next video.